The year was 1803, May. The humid Georgia air hung thick as blood over the coastal waters of St. Simon's Island. The Atlantic stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface broken only by the relentless crash of waves against a shore that had become America's gateway to human misery. For over a century, this coastline had witnessed the arrival of ship after ship, each one carrying its cargo of stolen souls from the markets of West Africa. But what was about to unfold on this particular day would be unlike anything that had ever happened in the bloody history of the American slave trade. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the water the color of dried blood, as if the ocean itself was stained with the suffering of all those who had crossed it in chains. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, swaying in a breeze that carried whispers of tragedy across the marshlands. They arrived chained, beaten, exhausted beyond human endurance. 75 souls from the proud Igbo lands of what is now southeastern Nigeria, packed like cargo in the suffocating belly of a slave ship that had become their floating tomb for the past 3 months. Their bodies told the story of the Middle Passage in scars and hollow cheeks, and eyes that had seen too much death. Iron shackles had carved permanent grooves into their ankles and wrists. The brand marks of their captors burned like accusations on their shoulders. Some limped from untreated injuries. Others coughed blood from lungs damaged by months of breathing the poisoned air below deck. But look closer. Look into those eyes that should have been broken, into faces that should have shown only resignation and defeat. See the way their backs remained straight, despite the weight of chains. Notice how they moved together, still communicating in glances and subtle gestures despite months of punishment for speaking their native tongue. These were not broken people. These were not the defeated husks that slave traders expected to find after 3 months of systematic brutality designed to crush the human spirit. Something had survived the Middle Passage that was not supposed to survive. Something dangerous to the entire foundation of American slavery. Pride. Unbroken, uncompromising pride. The slave ship Wanderer had departed from the Bight of Biafra, carrying men and women who had once governed themselves, who had built sophisticated societies along the Niger River, who had created art and literature and systems of justice that had flourished for centuries before the first European ever set foot on their shores. Among them were farmers who had fed entire villages with their knowledge of the land, craftsmen whose metalwork and pottery had been traded across vast networks spanning half the continent, warriors who had defended their communities with courage that had become legend, mothers who had raised children to be free and proud and unafraid, philosophers and poets, healers and teachers, leaders who had settled disputes and guided their people through good times and bad. They were not primitive cargo waiting to be civilized by their captors. They were a complete civilization that had been torn apart and scattered across the ocean for profit. As their captors dragged them onto American soil, something extraordinary happened. Something that would send shockwaves through the entire institution of slavery and echo through the centuries, like a war cry from the grave. The dock workers and plantation overseers who had come to inspect their new property expected to see the same broken compliance they had witnessed thousands of times before. The hollow stares of people whose spirits had been crushed by the machinery of the slave trade. The desperate gratitude of people so brutalized that they would accept any conditions, no matter how degrading, just to survive. Instead, they found themselves face to face with 75 people who moved with a dignity that made their captors deeply uncomfortable, who stood straight despite their chains, who looked their oppressors in the eye with something that sent chills down the spines of men who had made their fortunes breaking human beings. These Igbo captives looked at the chains on their wrists, at the plantation that awaited them, at the white faces that saw them as property worth approximately $300 each, and they made a choice that would stun their oppressors and inspire generations of the enslaved. They refused to bow, not with words, because words could be punished, not with violence, because violence could be crushed, but with something far more dangerous to the system that sought to own them. They refused to break. They refused to accept the fundamental premise of their captivity. They refused to agree that their lives as slaves were better than no lives at all. In that moment, standing on the edge of the New World with the Atlantic at their backs and the nightmare of American slavery stretching out before them, the Igbo made a collective decision that would transform the very meaning of freedom itself. They looked into the abyss of plantation slavery, with its promise of generations of brutality, and decided that there were fates worse than death. They stared down the most powerful economic system in the world and concluded that dying free was better than living enslaved. What happened next at a place that would become known as Igbo Landing created one of the most powerful legends of resistance in American history. A legend that would haunt every slave ship, terrify every plantation owner, and inspire every person who ever dreamed of freedom in the centuries that followed. This is their story. This is the day 75 people chose to redefine what victory could look like. This is the day the ocean became their final act of freedom, and freedom became something that no earthly power could ever take away. The ship that brought them was called the Wanderer, though some records remain deliberately obscured. It had sailed from the bustling slave markets of West Africa, where Igbo people had been torn from their villages through warfare, betrayal, and the grinding machinery of human trafficking that fed America's appetite for free labor. The Igbo were known for something that terrified slave traders. They were proud, unbreakable. In their homeland, they had governed themselves, built complex societies, and worshipped ancestors who they believed guided them even in death. They carried within them a spiritual strength that no amount of brutality could completely destroy. As they were forced off the ship onto the docks of St. Simon's Island, Georgia, their captors expected the usual resignation they had seen in countless other human cargo. The broken spirits, the defeated eyes, the compliance born of exhaustion and terror. But these Igbo captives were different. They moved with a dignity that unsettled their guards. They spoke in their native tongue, sharing something that sounded almost like plans. And in their eyes burned something that made experienced slave traders nervous. They had already decided that no master would ever own them. The question was not whether they would resist, but how. And the answer they chose would echo through history like thunder across water. To understand what happened next, you must understand what slavery was designed to do to the human soul. It was not just about free labor. It was about the complete destruction of identity, the systematic erasure of everything that made a person human. The plantation system was a machine built to break minds before it broke bodies. Families were torn apart and sold to distant states. Names were stripped away and replaced with whatever their owners decided to call them. Languages were forbidden. Religions were outlawed. Every connection to home, to ancestry, to self, was methodically severed. The Igbo standing on that Georgia shore could see their future mapped out in brutal clarity. Dawn to dusk, labor in the rice fields and cotton plantations. Whippings for the smallest infractions. Women violated by their masters. Children born into bondage. Property from their first breath. No hope of escape. No legal recourse. No recognition of their humanity under American law. They would be bred like livestock, worked until their bodies gave out, and buried in unmarked graves when they were no longer profitable. Their children would suffer the same fate, and their children's children. Generation after generation of souls trapped in a living hell with no end in sight. This was the choice America offered them. This was the freedom the New World promised. For the Igbo, looking into that abyss of endless suffering, death began to look like something else entirely. It began to look like liberation, but it was not just the horror of what awaited them that ignited the fire of resistance. It was the realization of how completely they had been betrayed, how thoroughly they had been lied to, how their captors had used their own hopes and humanity against them in the cruelest possible way. The spark that ignited everything came from understanding the depth of the deception that had brought them to this moment. During the voyage across the Atlantic, the slave traders had employed a strategy that was as psychologically sophisticated as it was morally bankrupt. They had learned that hope, even false hope, made their human cargo easier to manage during the brutal months at sea. Despair led to suicide, which reduced profits. But the right kind of lies could keep people alive long enough to be sold. Some of the Igbo had been told they were being taken to work temporarily, that after a period of labor, they would be free to return to Africa with payment for their service. The concept was not impossible to believe. Many African societies had systems of temporary labor or indentured service that eventually led to freedom and full integration into the community. Others had been promised they were being reunited with family members who had been taken in earlier raids. The slave traders had detailed knowledge of which villages had been attacked and which people had been captured. They used this information to craft believable stories about husbands who were waiting for wives, parents who were calling for children, siblings who had sent word to come join them in the new world. Still others had been told they were being taken to a land where their skills would be valued and rewarded. The Igbo were known for their expertise in metallurgy, agriculture, and craftsmanship. The traders spoke of opportunities to practice these skills in a place where such knowledge was desperately needed and highly compensated. The most sophisticated lie involved their spiritual beliefs. Some of the enslaved had been told that the journey across the water was a test from their ancestors, a trial that would lead to a kind of spiritual advancement. That, on the other side of the ocean, they would find not slavery, but a form of destiny that had been ordained by the spirits themselves. These lies were not random. They were carefully crafted based on detailed knowledge of Igbo culture, psychology, and social structures. The slave traders had spent years learning how to exploit the very qualities that made African societies strong: their emphasis on family, their respect for skill and knowledge, their deep spiritual connections to ancestors and community. During the voyage, when the reality of their situation began to become clear, the lies evolved. The traders explained away the chains as temporary security measures. They attributed the brutal conditions to the necessities of sea travel. They promised that things would be different once they reached land. Most insidiously, they used the Igbo's own cultural values against them. When people began to resist or despair, they were told that their ancestors were watching, that giving up would dishonor their families, that enduring the hardship was the only way to eventual reunion with loved ones. The psychological manipulation was so complete that some of the Igbo had actually begun to believe that their suffering was temporary, that the nightmarish conditions of the ship were just a passage to something better, that their captors, despite their cruelty, were ultimately taking them somewhere they needed to be. But as they were herded off the ship and saw the reality of American slavery laid out before them, the full scope of the betrayal became impossible to ignore. They saw the plantation overseers waiting with whips and chains and realized there would be no temporary labor arrangement. They saw the auctioneer calling out prices for their bodies and understood there would be no reunion with family members. They saw other enslaved people bearing the scars and hollow expressions of years in bondage, and recognized there would be no reward for their skills and knowledge. They witnessed the casual violence that was the foundation of the entire system, the way enslaved people were examined like livestock, the discussions of their bodies as property to be bought and sold. They heard the language used to describe them, not as people with names and histories and families, but as units of labor to be evaluated for strength and profitability. Most devastating of all, they realized that everything they had been told about their spiritual journey was a lie. This was not a test from their ancestors. This was not a path to spiritual advancement. This was a system designed to cut them off from everything sacred, everything that connected them to their true selves and their heritage. The lies had served their purpose during the Middle Passage, keeping the Igbo from throwing themselves overboard during the voyage when escape through death was still possible. But now, standing on American soil, face to face with their intended fate, those same lies became the catalyst for something their captors never expected. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They had been tricked, manipulated, used. Their own hopes and dreams and cultural values had been weaponized against them by people who understood exactly how to exploit their humanity for profit. The rage that followed was not the hot anger of a moment. It was something deeper and more dangerous. The cold fury of people who had been systematically betrayed by others who had studied them, understood them, and then used that knowledge to destroy them. This was not just about being captured or enslaved. This was about being lied to by people who had taken the time to learn their language, their customs, their spiritual beliefs, and their deepest fears and hopes, then used all of that knowledge to create an elaborate deception designed to make them complicit in their own destruction. The Igbo realized they had been targeted not just for their labor, but for their specific psychological and cultural vulnerabilities. They had been chosen because their strengths could be turned into weaknesses, their virtues could be transformed into tools of their own oppression. But this realization, devastating as it was, also contained the seeds of something their captors had not anticipated. If the slave traders understood Igbo culture well enough to manipulate it, then the Igbo could use that same cultural knowledge as a weapon of resistance. Their spiritual beliefs about death and water and the journey of souls were not lies told by their captors. Those were real, rooted in centuries of tradition and wisdom. Their understanding of collective action and shared responsibility was not manipulation. That was the foundation of how they had governed themselves for generations. The rage that burned through the group was pure and righteous and absolutely justified. But more than that, it was organized. It was purposeful. It was the fury of people who had been underestimated by their oppressors and were about to prove just how dangerous that underestimation could be. If this was the choice they were being given, a lifetime of slavery built on lies and manipulation and the systematic destruction of everything they held sacred, then they would make a choice of their own. A choice that no master, no overseer, no slave trader could control or profit from or turn to their advantage. They would choose to show the world exactly what they thought of American slavery. and their choice would echo through history as the ultimate rejection of a system that thought it could own not just their bodies, but their souls. What happened next was not chaos. It was not the desperate flailing of people who had given up hope. What unfolded in those crucial moments was something far more dangerous to the slave system than random violence or individual escape attempts. It was the power of a people who had governed themselves for generations, who understood that individual strength meant nothing without collective action, who knew how to organize and plan and execute decisions that required absolute trust and coordination. In their native Igbo tongue, words passed between them like wildfire spreading through dry grass. But these were not the panicked utterances of desperate people. These were not the random cries of confusion or despair. This was strategy. This was planning. This was the same language that had once organized their villages, coordinated their harvests, settled their disputes, and guided their communities through challenges that required wisdom and unity. The Igbo understood something about resistance that their captors had never anticipated. They knew that the most powerful form of rebellion was not the kind that could be crushed by superior numbers or better weapons. The most powerful resistance was the kind that struck at the very foundations of the oppressor's worldview, that challenged the basic assumptions on which the entire system was built. The guards were few, and they were overconfident. These men had done this thousands of times before. They had overseen the unloading of ship after ship, the processing of cargo after cargo of human beings who had been reduced to numbers in a ledger book. They expected the same broken compliance they always saw after 3 months of systematic brutality, designed to crush the human spirit. They did not expect 75 people to move as one unified force. The coordination began with glances, subtle looks that passed between people who had spent months learning to communicate without speaking, who had developed an entire language of survival that their captors could not understand. A tilt of the head meant readiness. A particular way of standing indicated position. A certain rhythm of breathing signaled timing. The Igbo had used the voyage itself as preparation for this moment. While their captors thought they were breaking them, they were actually studying their oppressors, learning their routines, understanding their weaknesses, and developing strategies for resistance that drew on centuries of military and political experience. Many of these people had been warriors before they were enslaved. They had defended their villages against raiders, organized resistance against hostile neighboring tribes, and developed tactics for fighting against superior numbers and better-equipped enemies. The skills that had once protected their homeland were now being adapted for a very different kind of battle. Others had been leaders in their communities, people who had experience making life-and-death decisions under pressure, who understood how to maintain unity when fear threatened to fracture the group, who knew how to inspire others to act beyond their perceived limits when survival was at stake. Still others brought spiritual knowledge that was crucial to what they were planning. They understood the deeper meaning of what they were about to do, the way their actions would connect them to their ancestors and their homeland, the spiritual implications of choosing death over slavery in this particular place and time. The moment came with the precision of a military operation that had been planned for months rather than minutes. One guard turned his back to deal with paperwork, confident that his human cargo would remain docile and manageable. Another bent down to adjust the chains on a particularly rebellious-looking prisoner, assuming that the show of force would intimidate the others into compliance. A third was distracted by the approach of plantation overseers who were arriving to inspect their potential purchases. And in that instant, the Igbo struck. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who had done this before, even though none of them had ever been in exactly this situation. They moved with the fluid grace of dancers who had rehearsed the same routine countless times, even though they were improvising every step. They moved with the deadly efficiency of warriors who trusted each other completely, even though they had been strangers before the slave ship brought them together. The attack was not random violence. It was surgical in its precision. Each person had a specific role, a particular target, a predetermined action that fit into a larger plan that seemed to unfold with supernatural coordination. Some focused on the guards, using techniques learned in their homeland for disabling enemies without killing them unnecessarily. These were not people consumed by bloodlust or revenge, but strategic fighters who understood that their goal was not to inflict maximum damage, but to create maximum opportunity for escape. Others worked on the chains and shackles, using knowledge of metalwork that they had brought from Africa to quickly disable the restraints that bound them. The same skills that had once created beautiful jewelry and agricultural tools were now being used to break the instruments of their oppression. Still others positioned themselves to prevent reinforcements from arriving, using their understanding of crowd dynamics and military tactics to control the space around them and buy time for the rest of the plan to unfold. The guards, trained to deal with individual acts of rebellion or small-scale resistance, found themselves completely overwhelmed by coordinated action from dozens of people working together with a unity that seemed impossible given their circumstances. These were men who had broken countless individuals through violence and intimidation, but they had never faced anything like the organized resistance of a people who had decided they would rather die than submit. Within minutes, their captors lay unconscious, fled in terror, or stood paralyzed by the realization that they had completely misunderstood what kind of people they were dealing with. The chains that had bound the Igbo were broken or cast aside. The instruments of their oppression lay scattered on the dock like the remnants of a nightmare from which they had finally awakened. For the first time since they had been captured in their homeland, the Igbo stood free on American soil. They could feel the Georgia earth beneath their feet, not as prisoners, but as human beings who had reclaimed their right to make their own choices about their own lives and deaths. But freedom on land was impossible, and they knew it. Every road led to recapture. Every direction promised only more chains, more masters, more plantations filled with people who would see their rebellion as proof that enslaved people needed to be controlled with even greater brutality. The dogs would be released within hours. The militias would be called out. The entire apparatus of the slave state would mobilize to hunt them down and make them pay for the crime of asserting their humanity. There was only one direction that offered true liberation. Only one path that led to a place where no master could follow and no earthly power could reclaim them. Only one route that would allow them to escape not just their captors, but the entire system that had sought to reduce them to property. They turned toward the water, toward the tidal marshes of Dunbar Creek that connected this place of suffering to the vast Atlantic Ocean that separated them from their homeland, toward the element that their spiritual beliefs told them could carry souls across any distance, through any barrier, to any destination that the spirit truly needed to reach. The water was calling them home, and after everything they had endured, after all the lies and betrayals and systematic brutality, home was the only place they wanted to go. What happened next became the moment that would define their legacy forever. The moment that would transform them from victims into legends, from casualties into victors, from people who had suffered slavery into people who had conquered it through the ultimate act of defiance. 75 people, moving as one, began to walk toward the tidal marshes of Dunbar Creek. They did not run. They did not flee in panic like people escaping from disaster. They did not scatter in different directions like individuals trying to save themselves. They walked together with the dignity and purpose of people who had made peace with their choice and were determined to see it through with honor. The walk itself was a ceremony, a ritual that drew on thousands of years of Igbo spiritual tradition, adapted for circumstances that none of their ancestors could have imagined, but that somehow felt familiar in the deepest part of their souls. This was not just movement from one place to another. This was a procession, a pilgrimage, a journey from one state of being to another. As they moved toward the water, they began to sing, not the broken songs of the defeated, not the desperate wails of people consumed by despair, but the ancestral chants of their homeland, songs that their grandmothers had taught them, melodies that had been passed down through generations, rhythms that connected them to every Igbo person who had ever lived and died and been remembered. The sound was unlike anything their former captors had ever heard. It rose from 75 throats in perfect harmony, as if they had been rehearsing together for years instead of months. The voices blended and separated, and came together again in patterns that seemed to follow some ancient musical logic that predated any European understanding of melody or rhythm. But this was more than music. This was communication with forces that existed beyond the physical world. In Igbo cosmology, songs were not just entertainment or even expression. They were technology for reaching across the barriers between the world of the living and the world of the spirits, between the realm of suffering and the realm of peace, between the land of captivity and the land of freedom. The melodies they sang told the story of their journey, not just the journey across the Atlantic in chains, but the spiritual journey that had brought them to this moment of ultimate choice. They sang of their homeland, with its red earth and flowing rivers and markets where people traded freely as equals. They sang of their families, calling out the names of children and parents and spouses who might never know what had happened to them, but who would somehow feel their spirits returning home. They sang of their ancestors, those who had died free and were waiting on the other side of the water to welcome them back into the community of spirits, where no white man could follow and no chains could bind. They sang of their own courage, acknowledging what they were about to do, not as tragedy, but as triumph, not as defeat, but as victory, over a system that thought it could own their souls. The tidal marsh stretched out before them like a pathway between worlds. The water was dark, reflecting the evening sky like a mirror that showed not just what was, but what could be. The tide was rising, which in Igbo spiritual understanding was significant. Rising water carried prayers upward, carried souls across barriers, carried the living into communion with those who had gone before. Step by step, they entered the water. The marsh grass brushed against their legs like the gentle touch of ancestors guiding them forward. The mud beneath their feet was soft and welcoming, not like the hard ground of captivity, but like the earth of their homeland that had nurtured them in childhood. The water swirled around their feet, then their ankles, then their calves. It was warm, heated by the Georgia sun, but they felt in it the coolness of the rivers of home. Each step took them deeper into the element that their spiritual beliefs told them was the bridge between all worlds, the medium through which souls could travel any distance and cross any barrier. They held hands as they walked, not desperately, like people drowning, but firmly, like people walking together into a new phase of existence. The connections between them were not just physical, but spiritual. They were linked not just by their shared experience of suffering, but by their shared understanding of what they were choosing and why it was the only choice that preserved their dignity as human beings. Some of the younger ones hesitated as the water reached their knees. The survival instinct that beats in every human heart fought against their decision, whispering that any life was better than no life, that somehow things might get better if they just endured a little longer. The water seemed suddenly cold and forbidding. The distance back to shore seemed short and manageable. But their elders held them close, reminded them of what awaited them on land, and helped them understand that this was not surrender, but victory. They spoke in low voices about the spiritual meaning of what they were doing, about how their deaths would send a message that would echo through the generations, about how their souls would be free in ways that their bodies never could be under American slavery. The voices of the singers grew stronger as the water rose higher. They sang of transformation, of journeys from one state of being to another, of the moment when the soul sheds the limitations of the physical body and discovers its true nature. They sang of freedom that could not be taken away by any earthly power, of dignity that could not be touched by any amount of brutality. As the water reached their waists, then their chests, the singing became more intense, more focused, more deliberately directed toward the spiritual realm they were preparing to enter. They were calling to their ancestors, announcing their arrival, asking for guidance and welcome, and the strength to complete their journey with honor. Some tried to turn back as the water reached their necks. The body's desperate desire for survival overwhelmed their spiritual commitment to freedom. But their brothers and sisters were there, surrounding them with love and support, and gentle insistence that this was the path they had chosen together, the only path that led to true liberation. The water rose higher. The voices grew softer but no less determined, and one by one, 75 souls made the final choice to prioritize their spiritual freedom over their physical survival. They chose drowning over slavery. They chose death with dignity over life without hope. They chose to define the terms of their own existence rather than accept the terms imposed by their oppressors. In those final moments, as the water closed over their heads, they were not victims. They were victors. They had faced down the most powerful economic system in the world and refused to participate in their own oppression. They had looked into the machinery of American slavery and decided it was a fate worse than death, then acted on that decision with courage that would inspire resistance movements for centuries to come. The water that claimed their bodies could not claim their victory, could not diminish their choice, could not reduce their act of resistance to mere tragedy. They had died free, and in a world where freedom for people who looked like them was almost impossible to achieve in life, dying free was the ultimate triumph over a system designed to convince them they were not fully human. Their spirits, according to their own beliefs, began the journey home across the water that connected Georgia to Africa, slavery to freedom, the world of suffering to the world of peace. They had found the one path that no master could block, the one road that led to a place where they could never again be reduced to property or treated as less than human. The tide carried their bodies, but it also carried their message. A message that would spread through every slave quarter in the South, whispered from plantation to plantation, generation to generation. A message that would haunt the dreams of every slaveholder and inspire the hopes of every person still in chains. The message was simple and devastating. We will not be broken. We will not accept degradation as the price of survival. We will choose our own destiny, even if that destiny is death. And our choice proves that you can never truly own us, no matter how many laws you pass or how much violence you use. Because freedom lives in the human spirit, and the human spirit cannot be chained. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of a cemetery or the respectful hush of a church service. It was the deafening silence of a world that had suddenly been forced to confront a truth so powerful and so disturbing that it rendered speech impossible. The few guards who had witnessed what happened stood frozen on the shore, their minds struggling to process what they had just seen. These were men who had made their living from human suffering, who had built their understanding of the world on the assumption that enslaved people were naturally submissive, that they valued survival above all else, that they could be controlled through the simple application of superior force. But the Igbo had just shattered every assumption the slave system was built on. This was not supposed to be possible. According to everything these men had been taught about the nature of slavery and the character of African people, what they had just witnessed was literally unthinkable. Slaves were supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to work. They were supposed to accept their fate with resignation. They were supposed to value their lives above all else, no matter how degraded those lives might be. The guards stood there like men who had watched the sun rise in the west, or seen water flow uphill. The foundations of their worldview had cracked, and they could feel the entire structure of their beliefs about slavery and race and human nature beginning to collapse around them. Some of them would never speak of what they had seen. They would go to their graves carrying the image of 75 people walking into the water singing songs of freedom, refusing to be broken even by death itself. The memory would haunt their dreams and poison their confidence in the righteousness of their cause. Others would try to explain it away, to find some interpretation that preserved their comfortable assumptions about the natural order of things. They would tell themselves and anyone who would listen that what they had witnessed was madness, not courage, mental illness, not spiritual strength, a tragic waste of valuable property, not a devastating indictment of the system that had created the conditions that made such a choice seem preferable to life. But even as they struggled to rationalize what they had seen, they could not escape the fundamental challenge it posed to everything they believed about slavery and their own role in maintaining it. If enslaved people would rather die than submit, what did that say about the nature of the system itself? If Africans had the capacity for such coordinated resistance and spiritual courage, what did that say about the racial theories that justified their enslavement? When the plantation owners arrived to collect their new property, they found only empty chains scattered on the dock and traumatized guards stammering about mass suicide. The financial loss was staggering. 75 people represented tens of thousands of dollars in today's money, an investment that had literally walked into the ocean rather than generate profits for their intended owners. But the psychological impact was far worse than any monetary loss. John Cooper, one of the most powerful plantation owners in Georgia, had been expecting to purchase several of the Igbo to work his cotton and rice fields. He arrived at the dock to find chaos instead of commerce, profound silence instead of the usual business of buying and selling human beings. When he learned what had happened, his reaction was not grief for the lives lost, but rage at the disruption of his economic plans. But beneath the rage was something else, something that would keep him awake at night for months to come. Fear. Not fear of individual rebellion, which could be crushed with superior force. Not fear of escape attempts, which could be prevented with better security. Fear of the idea that had been planted in his mind by the Igbo's choice. If slaves would rather die than serve, how could anyone maintain the fiction that slavery was a benevolent institution? How could plantation owners continue to tell themselves that they were providing care and guidance to people who were naturally suited for bondage? How could they sleep peacefully in their beds knowing that the people working their fields might be planning their own version of the Igbo's final resistance? The news spread through the Georgia coast like wildfire, carried by other slave traders who heard the story and felt a chill of recognition. They had all seen individual acts of resistance, attempted escapes, work slowdowns, occasional violence, but they had never encountered anything like the coordinated defiance of an entire group choosing death over slavery. Some tried to suppress the story, understanding instinctively how dangerous it could be if it spread to the enslaved population. They attempted to bribe witnesses to silence, to destroy records that might document what had happened, to create alternative explanations that would be less threatening to the stability of the slave system. But it was too late. Too many people had witnessed the Igbo Landing. Too many guards. Too many dock workers. Too many plantation overseers who had come expecting to participate in a routine transaction. and instead found themselves confronting the most powerful act of resistance in the history of American slavery. More importantly, word had already begun to spread through the hidden networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. House servants who overheard their masters discussing the incident carried the news to field workers. Traveling preachers, many of them enslaved themselves, shared the story as they moved from plantation to plantation. Enslaved craftsmen who traveled between properties to sell their work whispered the tale in the brief moments when overseers were not watching. The story they told was not the sanitized version that would eventually appear in official records. It was not about mental illness or tragic waste, or the inability of Africans to adapt to civilized society. It was about courage that transcended death, resistance that could not be crushed by any amount of force, and freedom that existed beyond the reach of any earthly power. In the slave quarters of plantations across Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and beyond, the Igbo Landing became part of the secret oral tradition that sustained enslaved communities. It joined the stories of other acts of resistance, other moments when ordinary people became extraordinary in their refusal to accept injustice. But this story was different from tales of successful escapes or violent rebellions. This was about something that went deeper than individual survival or even collective resistance. This was about the assertion of human dignity in the face of a system designed to destroy it. This was about people who chose to define the terms of their own existence, rather than accept the terms imposed by their oppressors. The enslaved people who heard the story understood its true meaning in ways that their masters never could. They understood that the Igbo had not committed suicide but had achieved the ultimate victory over slavery. They had died free, which in a world where freedom for people who looked like them was almost impossible to achieve in life, represented a form of triumph that no amount of force could diminish. Plantation owners throughout the South began to look at their own enslaved workers with new suspicion and fear. Were they also capable of such defiance? Were they also planning their own escape through death? How could masters maintain control over people who valued freedom more than life itself? The authorities worked desperately to contain the story, to minimize its impact, to prevent it from inspiring similar acts of resistance. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. This was not just news that could be suppressed, or a story that could be censored. This was an idea that had taken root in the collective consciousness of enslaved people, and ideas, once planted, have a way of growing beyond anyone's ability to control them. The idea was simple but revolutionary. We have the power to choose. Even in the worst circumstances, even under the most brutal oppression, even when every option seems closed to us, we still have the ultimate choice about how we respond to our situation. We can choose to preserve our dignity, even if we cannot preserve our lives. We can choose to resist even if we cannot win. We can choose to remain human even when the system is designed to convince us we are property. That idea would haunt every slave ship, every auction block, every plantation, and every system of oppression that followed. It would inspire resistance movements, fuel escape attempts, and give strength to people who needed to believe that freedom was possible even when it seemed impossible. But more than that, it would serve as an eternal reminder that there are some things that no amount of force can take away from the human spirit. There are some choices that belong to the individual soul and cannot be made by any external authority. There are some forms of victory that exist beyond the reach of any earthly power. The Igbo had proven all of this with their final act. They had shown the world that the most powerful form of resistance is sometimes the willingness to lose everything rather than surrender who you are. And that lesson would echo through history, inspiring every person who ever faced the choice between survival and dignity, between compliance and conscience, between accepting injustice and asserting their fundamental humanity. But the real power of the Igbo Landing was not in what the white authorities thought about it. The real power was in how the story spread through the hidden networks of the enslaved. In the slave quarters of Georgia plantations, whispered conversations carried the tale from cabin to cabin. The Igbo walked into the sea. They chose their own fate. They refused to be broken. Traveling preachers, many of them enslaved themselves, carried the story across state lines. Field workers shared it during the brief moments when overseers looked away. House servants passed it along in the kitchens and laundry rooms of the big houses. From Georgia to South Carolina to Virginia and beyond, the legend of the Igbo Landing became part of the secret oral tradition that sustained enslaved communities. It joined the stories of other acts of resistance, other moments when ordinary people became extraordinary in their refusal to accept injustice. The story grew in the telling, as powerful stories do. Some versions said the Igbo could fly, that they had sprouted wings and flown back to Africa rather than drowned. Others claimed you could still hear their songs carried on the wind during storms. Still others whispered that the Igbo had the power to curse any slaveholder who dared to set foot in those waters. But beneath all the mythological embellishments was a core truth that every enslaved person understood. Freedom was worth dying for. Dignity was not negotiable. And sometimes the most powerful act of resistance was the willingness to say no, even when that no meant death. Slaveholders began to fear the story almost as much as they feared actual rebellion. Because the Igbo Landing proved that their control was an illusion. People who would rather die than submit could never truly be enslaved. But those in power knew how dangerous the truth could be. So they worked to bury it beneath a more comfortable lie. The official records, written by white authorities and preserved in courthouse files, told a very different story. They spoke of mass suicide, mental illness, the tragic waste of valuable property. They painted the Igbo as mentally unstable, unable to adapt to civilized society, driven to irrational self-destruction by their primitive minds. This was not accidental. This was deliberate historical revision designed to protect the institution of slavery from the most damning indictment possible. If the Igbo had made a rational choice to die rather than live enslaved, what did that say about the nature of slavery itself? So the official version became one of pathology rather than resistance, madness rather than courage, tragedy rather than triumph. The Igbo were transformed from heroes into victims, from resistors into casualties of their own supposed inability to comprehend their good fortune at being brought to America. But official records are written by the victors, and the victors in this case had every reason to lie. The truth survived in the places power could not reach, in the songs passed down through generations of enslaved families, in the stories told in the quarters when the masters were asleep, in the collective memory of a people who understood exactly what the Igbo had done and why they had done it. To the enslaved communities of the South, the Igbo Landing was not a suicide. It was the ultimate act of freedom. It was proof that the human spirit could not be broken, no matter how much force was applied. It was evidence that even in the darkest circumstances, people could still choose their own destiny. The truth the authorities tried to hide was simple and terrifying. The Igbo had looked at American slavery and decided it was a fate worse than death, and they had the courage to act on that decision. To understand the true power of what happened at Igbo Landing, you must understand how the Igbo themselves saw death and water and the journey between worlds. In Igbo cosmology, water was not an ending, but a passage. The ocean that separated them from their homeland was not a barrier, but a bridge. When they walked into those tidal waters, they were not walking toward destruction. They were walking toward home. The Igbo believed that the souls of the dead could travel across water to rejoin their ancestors. Death in a foreign land while maintaining one's dignity and spiritual integrity was far preferable to a life of degradation that corrupted the soul itself. They were not committing suicide. They were staging the ultimate escape. Every step into that rising tide was an act of rebellion that struck at the foundations of the slave system. Slavery depended on the belief that life under any circumstances was preferable to death, that people would endure any degradation, accept any brutality, submit to any humiliation, rather than face the unknown of death. The Igbo shattered that assumption completely. They proved that there were fates worse than death, and that American slavery was one of them. They demonstrated that the human spirit, when pushed beyond certain limits, would choose the unknown over the unbearable. Their walk into the water became a symbol that transcended the specific moment. It represented the refusal to be broken, the rejection of a system that sought to reduce human beings to property, the assertion that some things, dignity and spiritual freedom among them, were worth dying for. In choosing death over slavery, the Igbo had achieved something their captors could never take away from them. They had died free. And in a world where freedom for people who looked like them was almost impossible to achieve in life, dying free became the ultimate victory. Now I want you to sit with this story for a moment. Really sit with it. Because it forces us to confront a question that cuts to the very core of what it means to be human. What would you choose? If you found yourself in chains, stripped of your name, your family, your dignity, your future, if you knew that tomorrow would bring the whip, and the day after that more whips, and that your children would be born into the same hell, and their children after them, if you understood that your body would be worked until it broke, that your spirit would be crushed daily, that you would never again taste freedom or respect or simple human kindness, if you stood on that shore, looking at a lifetime of brutality stretching endlessly ahead of you, and the only choice was between the certainty of that suffering and the unknown of death, What would you choose? It is easy to say we would choose life. Easy to believe that any life is better than no life. Easy to think that somehow, some way, things might get better if we just endured long enough. But the Igbo had looked into the machine of American slavery and seen the truth. There was no getting better. There was no escape. There was no hope of change. There was only the endless grinding of human souls into profit for their oppressors. They made their choice with clear eyes and steady hearts. They answered the question with their feet, their voices raised in song, and their final breath drawn as free people. 75 human beings looked at the most powerful economic system in the world and said no. They faced down the entire apparatus of American slavery and chose their own ending. They walked into those waters not as victims, but as victors who had refused to let their oppressors define the terms of their existence. Their choice echoes across the centuries as a challenge to every generation. How much would you sacrifice for freedom? How far would you go to preserve your dignity? What is the price of a soul? And who gets to decide when that price is too high? The water that claimed 75 bodies that day in 1803 could not claim their story. It could not drown their message. It could not wash away the profound challenge they had issued to every system of oppression, every attempt to reduce human beings to property, every force that sought to convince people that survival was more important than dignity. Their story survived. It spread. It evolved. It became something far more powerful than the slave system that tried to destroy it. The Igbo Landing became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance in the entire history of American slavery, and its influence extended far beyond the antebellum South to inspire movements for freedom and human dignity across the globe. For more than 2 centuries, their story has traveled from generation to generation, carried by people who understood that some truths are too important to let die. It survived the efforts of slaveholders to suppress it. It outlasted the system of slavery itself. It transcended the racial boundaries that were designed to divide people and found resonance in the hearts of anyone who had ever faced the choice between principle and survival. The story inspired enslaved people who heard it whispered in the quarters during the long decades before the Civil War. When Frederick Douglass wrote about the spiritual songs that sustained enslaved communities, he was describing the kind of hidden resistance that the Igbo Landing represented. When Harriet Tubman led people to freedom on the Underground Railroad, she carried with her the knowledge that some things were worth risking everything for. The story gave strength to freed people rebuilding their lives after emancipation, reminding them that their ancestors had included people who chose death over slavery, who refused to be broken no matter what was done to them. When former slaves struggled to create new lives in a society that still saw them as less than human, the memory of the Igbo's courage provided a foundation for rebuilding not just their economic circumstances, but their sense of dignity and self-worth. It provided courage to civil rights activists facing down lynch mobs and police dogs during the long struggle for equality in the 20th century. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus. When Ruby Bridges walked through that angry crowd to integrate a New Orleans school. When countless unnamed people made the daily choice to resist segregation. Despite the personal cost, they were drawing on the same spiritual wellspring that had sustained the Igbo. The story resonated beyond the African American community to inspire other oppressed peoples around the world. During the Holocaust, when Jews faced the choice between death in gas chambers and collaboration with their oppressors, some found inspiration in stories of people who had chosen death over degradation. During the struggles against apartheid in South Africa, against colonialism in Africa and Asia, against authoritarian regimes throughout the world, the Igbo Landing provided a model for understanding resistance that transcended conventional definitions of victory and defeat. But the power of the story extends beyond its historical influence to its continued relevance in our contemporary world. The Igbo Landing speaks to anyone who has ever faced a choice between their principles and their security, between doing what is right and doing what is safe, between maintaining their integrity and preserving their comfort. In our modern era, we face different forms of the same fundamental choice that confronted the Igbo. We may not face physical slavery, but we encounter systems that seek to reduce us to our economic function, that measure our worth by our productivity, that encourage us to sacrifice our values for material success. We live in a world where people are pressured to remain silent about injustice to protect their careers, where whistleblowers face retaliation for exposing corruption, where speaking truth to power can result in social and economic punishment. The Igbo Landing reminds us that there are worse things than losing our jobs, our social status, or our material comfort. We inhabit a society where people are encouraged to accept incremental degradation as the price of stability, where we are told that systems of oppression are too complex to change. where we are persuaded that our individual choices don't matter in the face of overwhelming structural forces. The Igbo Landing proves that individual choices, made collectively, can challenge the most powerful systems. We exist in a time when people are bombarded with messages designed to convince them that they are powerless, that resistance is futile, that the best they can hope for is to find a comfortable place within systems of exploitation. The Igbo Landing demonstrates that even the most powerless people possess forms of power that their oppressors cannot understand or control. The waters of Dunbar Creek still flow into the Atlantic. The tides still rise and fall, where the Igbo made their final stand. The physical geography remains largely unchanged from that day in 1803, when 75 people transformed a routine business transaction into one of the most powerful acts of resistance in human history. But the spiritual geography of that place has been forever altered. According to the stories passed down through generations of African Americans in the Georgia Sea Islands, if you listen carefully when the wind is right, you can still hear their voices. Not the voices of the defeated, but the voices of the victorious. Not the cries of despair, but the songs of freedom. Some say it is just the sound of wind through the marsh grass, the natural acoustics of water moving through the tidal channels, the ordinary music of a landscape that has witnessed countless sunrises and sunsets. Others know better. They know it is the sound of spirits who died free and remain free still, who continue to sing the songs that accompanied them on their final journey from bondage to liberation. The sound carries across the centuries like a message in a bottle, washing up on the shores of our consciousness whenever we need to be reminded of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to be broken. It whispers the same truth that the Igbo proclaimed with their final act: you cannot own what chooses to be free. Visitors to the site today often report a profound sense of presence, a feeling that they are not alone, that they are being watched over by spirits who understand the ongoing struggle for human dignity. Scholars and tourists and descendants of enslaved people come seeking to understand what happened there, and many leave with the sense that they have encountered something that transcends historical fact to touch the realm of eternal truth. The Igbo Landing has become a pilgrimage site for people seeking to connect with the deepest sources of human courage and resistance. It serves as a reminder that the struggle for freedom is not something that happened in the past, but something that continues in every generation, in every individual choice to stand up for principle over convenience, dignity over safety, truth over comfort. But perhaps most importantly, the site serves as proof that some victories exist beyond conventional measurements of success and failure. The Igbo lost their lives, but they won something more valuable than life. They failed to escape slavery in the physical sense, but they achieved a form of freedom that no earthly power could take away from them. 75 people died that day, but 75 spirits were born. Spirits that have haunted every slave ship, every auction block, every plantation, and every system of oppression since. Spirits that whisper the same message the Igbo carried into those waters. You are more than your circumstances. You are greater than your suffering. You possess choices that no external authority can make for you. The legacy of the Igbo Landing is not just historical, but prophetic. It speaks not only to what people have been capable of in the past, but to what we might be capable of in the future, if we possess even a fraction of their courage, if we love freedom even half as much as they did, if we are willing to pay even a small portion of the price they paid for their principles. Their story has become part of the permanent record of human possibility, proof that ordinary people can become extraordinary when they refuse to accept the unacceptable, evidence that the human spirit contains resources that can be discovered only in extremity, demonstration that there are forms of victory that exist beyond the reach of any earthly power. Every time their story is told, every time their memory is honored, every time someone draws inspiration from their example, slavery trembles again. Not just the historical institution of slavery, but every system that seeks to reduce human beings to their utility, every force that tries to convince people they are property, every attempt to break the human spirit through the application of sufficient pressure. The Igbo proved that you cannot break what refuses to be broken. They demonstrated that you cannot own what chooses to be free. They showed that sometimes the most powerful victory is the willingness to lose everything, rather than surrender who you are. Their choice reverberates through history as both achievement and challenge. It stands as proof of what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept degradation as the price of survival. It serves as a challenge to every generation to measure their own courage against the standards set by 75 people who chose death over slavery, and in doing so achieved a form of immortality that their oppressors could never attain. The water that day did not just claim their bodies. It baptized them into a different kind of existence, one where they would be remembered not for how they suffered, but for how they chose to end their suffering, not for what was done to them, but for what they did in response, not as victims of history, but as its authors. They wrote their names in water, but water has memory. It carries their story to every shore it touches, whispers their message to every ear that listens, preserves their legacy for every generation that needs to know that freedom is possible, that dignity is worth defending, that some choices echo across eternity. The Igbo Landing remains one of the most powerful demonstrations in human history that there are some things no earthly power can take away from the human soul, some choices that belong to the individual spirit and cannot be made by any external authority, some forms of resistance that strike at the very heart of oppression and reveal it for the spiritual poverty it truly represents. 75 people chose freedom over life, and in doing so proved that freedom and life are not always the same thing. They chose dignity over survival, and in doing so demonstrated that sometimes survival requires the sacrifice of everything that makes survival worthwhile. They chose to die as they had lived, as human beings who recognized no master, accepted no owner, submitted to no authority that sought to deny their fundamental humanity. And in that choice, they achieved something that no amount of force could take away from them. No passage of time could diminish, no official record could erase. They died free, and they remain free still, their spirits continuing to sing the songs of liberation that no earthly power can silence. Their choice continuing to inspire anyone who faces the eternal human question of what is worth living for and what is worth dying for. This is the legacy of the Igbo Landing. This is the truth that 75 souls carved into the bedrock of American history with their final act of defiance. This is the message they left for every generation that would come after them, written not in words, but in the very water that carried them home. They were stolen from their homeland by people who saw them as nothing more than units of labor to be exploited for profit. They were chained in the belly of slave ships and subjected to brutality designed to break their spirits before it broke their bodies. They were brought to a foreign shore to be sold like cattle, examined like livestock, purchased like machinery. But they were never, not for a single moment, defeated. When faced with the choice between a life without dignity and a death with honor, they chose honor. When offered survival at the cost of their souls, they chose their souls. When the entire weight of American slavery pressed down upon them, demanding submission to a system that would have ground their humanity into profit for their oppressors, they looked that system in the eye and said no. Their refusal echoes across more than 2 centuries as the most powerful single word in the history of American resistance. No to slavery. No to degradation. No to the lie that any human being can be reduced to property. No to the fiction that survival is worth any price. No to the illusion that freedom is something that can be granted or denied by external authorities. That word, no, spoken by 75 people walking into the waters of Dunbar Creek, carries more moral authority than all the laws that legalize slavery, more spiritual power than all the religious justifications for human bondage, more lasting influence than all the economic arguments for treating people as property. Their story deserves to be told not just as history, but as prophecy. Not just as something that happened in the past, but as something that speaks to the present and points toward the future. Not just as the tragic end of 75 lives, but as the triumphant beginning of an idea that would eventually help destroy the system that killed them. Because that's what they accomplished with their final choice. They planted a seed of resistance that would grow over the centuries into movements that would challenge every form of oppression, every attempt to reduce human beings to their utility, every system built on the premise that some people exist to serve others. The abolitionists who fought to end slavery drew inspiration from stories like the Igbo Landing. The Underground Railroad conductors who risked their lives to lead people to freedom carried the memory of those who had chosen death over bondage. The Union soldiers who died to preserve a nation that could no longer tolerate slavery were motivated by the knowledge that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The civil rights workers who faced down segregation in the 20th century walked in the footsteps of people who had shown that dignity was more important than safety. The freedom riders, the lunch counter protesters, the children who integrated hostile schools, the ordinary people who made extraordinary choices to resist injustice, all of them drew from the same wellspring of courage that had sustained the Igbo. And that wellspring continues to flow today, in every person who chooses to speak truth to power despite the personal cost, in every individual who refuses to remain silent in the face of injustice. In every human being who decides that some principles are worth defending even when defending them requires sacrifice. The Igbo Landing reminds us that we are all faced with choices about what we will accept and what we will resist, about what we will compromise on and what we will never surrender, about what kind of people we want to be and what kind of world we want to live in. Their story asks us difficult questions that we cannot avoid just because they make us uncomfortable. How much injustice are we willing to witness in silence? How much degradation are we prepared to accept as normal? How much of our humanity are we ready to trade for security, comfort, or the approval of others? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are practical challenges that we face every day in smaller but still significant ways. Every time we see someone being mistreated and choose not to intervene. Every time we witness discrimination and decide it's not our problem. Every time we allow systems of exploitation to continue because challenging them would be inconvenient or risky. The Igbo challenges us to live up to their example not by choosing death but by choosing life. Real life. Authentic life. Life lived with integrity and purpose and commitment to values that transcend our immediate self-interest. They showed us what human beings are capable of when they refuse to be broken. They demonstrated that there are forms of power that exist beyond physical force, beyond legal authority, beyond economic pressure. They proved that the human spirit contains resources that can be discovered only when we are pushed to our absolute limits. But they also showed us that we don't have to wait until we're pushed to those limits to access those resources. We can choose courage before we're forced to choose between courage and cowardice. We can commit to our principles before we're tested by extreme circumstances. We can decide what we stand for before we're forced to decide what we're willing to die for. If this story has touched you, if it has changed something in how you see courage and resistance and the price of freedom, then you have received the gift that the Igbo intended to give. They wanted their choice to matter beyond the moment of their death. They wanted their sacrifice to inspire others to live with the kind of dignity they chose to die with. The greatest way to honor their memory is not just to remember their story, but to let their story change how you live your own life. To ask yourself what principles you would never compromise, what values you would never abandon, what aspects of your humanity you would never surrender no matter what pressures were brought to bear against you. The Igbo should never be forgotten, and forgetting them is easier than we might think. In a world that constantly encourages us to focus on our immediate concerns, our personal problems, our individual struggles, it's easy to lose sight of the larger questions about human dignity and collective resistance that their story raises. Their choice should never be dismissed as the product of a different time, a different place, a different set of circumstances that have no relevance to our contemporary lives. The forces that they resisted, the reduction of human beings to their economic value, the systematic denial of dignity to entire groups of people, the use of violence to maintain systems of exploitation, are still with us in different forms. Their courage should never be diminished by those who would prefer to think of resistance as something that belongs to history, rather than something that's needed in every generation. Every time someone tells their story, every time someone draws inspiration from their example, every time someone chooses dignity over comfort because of their influence, slavery trembles again. Not just the historical institution of American slavery, but every contemporary system that seeks to convince people they are worth less than their full humanity. Every structure that tries to reduce individuals to their usefulness to others. Every force that attempts to break the human spirit through the application of sufficient pressure. Share their story. Tell someone else about the day 75 people chose death over slavery, and in doing so proved that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be reduced to property, no matter how much force is applied against it. Talk about what their choice means in our current world, where different forms of oppression continue to operate, where people still face choices between their principles and their survival, where the powerful still try to convince the powerless that resistance is futile and submission is wisdom. Discuss the questions their story raises about what you would choose, what you would sacrifice, what you would never surrender. Use their example to examine your own life, your own choices, your own relationship to systems that might be asking you to compromise your humanity for your security. Let their story be a catalyst for conversations about courage, about dignity, about the price of freedom, and the cost of slavery in all its forms. Let it be a bridge between the historical struggles for human liberation and the contemporary challenges we face in creating a world where everyone's humanity is recognized and respected. But most importantly, let their story be a reminder that you have more power than you think you do, that you have choices available to you that no external authority can make for you, that you possess a form of freedom that exists in your heart and cannot be taken away by any force, no matter how overwhelming it might seem. The Igbo proved that even people who had lost everything, their homeland, their families, their freedom, their future, still possessed the ultimate power to choose how they would respond to their circumstances. They still retained the ability to determine what their lives would mean, what their deaths would represent, what legacy they would leave for future generations. You have that same power. You may not face the extreme circumstances they faced, but you face the same fundamental choice between accepting the unacceptable and refusing to be broken by it. You have the same opportunity to decide what you stand for and what you will never bow down to. Their choice continues to echo through history as both inspiration and challenge. It inspires us by showing us what human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender their humanity. It challenges us to examine whether we possess even a fraction of their courage, whether we love freedom even half as much as they did. When you think about the Igbo Landing, ask yourself, what is my version of walking into the water? What is my way of choosing dignity over degradation, principle over survival, truth over comfort? What is my method of refusing to be broken by systems that seek to reduce me to something less than human? Your answer doesn't have to involve physical death, but it might involve the death of some comfortable illusions about the world you live in. It might require the sacrifice of some privileges that come from remaining silent about injustice. It might demand the courage to speak truth, even when truth is unwelcome. The waters of Dunbar Creek continue to rise and fall with the tides, just as they did on that day in 1803 when 75 people walked into them singing songs of freedom. Those same waters connect that place to the vast Atlantic Ocean, to the shores of Africa, to every coast where people have struggled for liberation, to every place where the human spirit has refused to be conquered. The Igbo Landing. Remember their choice. Remember their courage. Remember their refusal to be broken. Remember that they walked into the water free, and they remain free still. Remember that freedom lives in the human heart and can be claimed by anyone who loves it more than life itself. Remember that dignity is not something that can be granted or denied by others, but something that belongs to the human soul and can be defended by anyone who understands its value. Remember that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from what we gain but from what we refuse to lose. Remember that the most powerful resistance is sometimes the willingness to say no when everyone around you is saying yes, to stand when everyone else is kneeling, to choose the unknown over the unbearable. The Igbo chose the water. They chose the tide. They chose the journey home to ancestors who welcomed them as heroes rather than victims, as people who had died free rather than lived enslaved. Their song continues to echo across the water, carried by winds that know no borders, preserved by tides that recognize no masters, sustained by hearts that understand the eternal truth they proclaimed with their final breath. You cannot chain the human spirit. You cannot own what chooses to be free. And sometimes the most profound victory is the courage to lose everything rather than surrender who you are. The Igbo Landing. A story of 75 people who chose freedom over life and in doing so proved that freedom and life, when lived with dignity, are the same thing. Their choice reverberates through eternity, challenging every generation to measure their courage against the standard they set, inspiring every individual to discover the forms of resistance available to them, reminding every human being that they possess power that no earthly authority can take away. They walked into the water free, and in the deepest sense, the most important sense, the only sense that ultimately matters, they remain free still.